In our previous episode, we stood in the marble halls of ancient Rome. We watched Julius Caesar, dictator, reformer, legend, walk into the Senate, surrounded by men he called friends. And then, in a storm of blades, the Republic collapsed. One murder, 23 stab wounds, and the birth of an empire. But today, we leave the blood-soaked stones of Pompey's theater and step into the quiet streets of modern Japan, a country known for peace, for precision, for silence. Until one morning in July 2022, when that silence was shattered. He was Japan's longest-serving prime minister, a man who reshaped his nation's economy, defense, and place in the world. And while giving a speech outside a train station, he was shot twice. This is not just the story of Shinzo Abe's assassination, it's the story of a nation stunned by violence, of a legacy interrupted, and of the shadows behind the trigger. Because when a bullet breaks the silence in a country that has outlawed guns, the echo is deafening. Welcome to the red pages of history, where power bleeds, and every moment can be the last. He was born into power, but he earned his place in history. Shinzo Abe, born on September 21, 1954 in Tokyo, came from one of Japan's most influential political dynasties. His father, Shintaro Abe, served as foreign minister. His grandfather, Nobusuke Kishi, was prime minister in the 1950s, a controversial figure with ties to Japan's wartime government. Politics wasn't just in Abe's blood, it was his destiny. He studied political science at Seikei University, then moved to the U.S. to study public policy at the University of Southern California. But his real education came in the corridors of power. In 1982, Abe entered politics as secretary to his father. By 1993, he was elected to Japan's House of Representatives. And from that moment, he rose, fast. He was young, sharp, conservative, and unapologetically ambitious. In 2006, at just 52 years old, Abe became Japan's youngest post-war prime minister. His first term was short, plagued by scandals and health issues. He resigned in 2007, but he wasn't done. In 2012, Abe returned, stronger, sharper, and ready to reshape Japan. He launched Abenomics, a bold economic strategy built on three arrows: monetary easing, fiscal stimulus, structural reforms. The goal? To pull Japan out of decades of stagnation, to revive growth, to restore confidence. And it worked, at least for a while. But Abe wasn't just an economist, he was a strategist. He pushed to revise Japan's pacifist constitution, aiming to give the self-defense forces more freedom. He strengthened ties with the United States, especially under President Trump. They golfed together, dined together, and aligned on key issues. He took a tough stance on North Korea, demanding accountability for abducted Japanese citizens. And he challenged China's rise, especially over Taiwan and the South China Sea. Inside Japan, Abe was a polarizing figure. Some saw him as a visionary, others feared his nationalism. He led the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, with iron discipline. He survived scandals, he outmaneuvered rivals, and he became Japan's longest-serving prime minister, a record that cemented his legacy. Even after stepping down in 2020 due to health issues, Abe remained a political force. He gave speeches, he advised leaders, he stirred debate. And then, in 2022, while campaigning for a fellow LDP candidate in the city of Nara, he was shot, twice, with a homemade gun, in broad daylight. The man who had reshaped Japan's economy, defense, and diplomacy fell on the pavement, and the silence that followed was deafening. It was a quiet morning in Nara, Japan. July 8, 2022. The streets were calm, The crowd was modest, and Shinzo Abe, Japan's longest-serving prime minister, stood outside Yamato Saidaiji Station delivering a campaign speech. He spoke with ease. No bulletproof glass, no armored vehicles, just a microphone, a few security guards, and the trust of a nation where political violence was almost unheard of. But in that crowd stood a man who had been planning this moment for months. Tetsuya Yamagami, 41 years old, unemployed, quiet, invisible. He had no criminal record, no history of political activism, no ties to extremist groups, but he carried something heavier than ideology, a personal vendetta. Yamagami's story began decades earlier. His mother, once the head of a small construction company, had become deeply involved with the Unification Church, a controversial religious group founded in South Korea. She donated everything, over 100 million yen, nearly $775,000, drained from the family's savings. The business collapsed. The family fell into poverty. Yamagami's father died. His brother committed suicide, and he, still a teenager, watched his world unravel. He joined the Maritime Self-Defense Force in 2002, hoping for structure. But after 3 years, he left, drifting, disconnected. He blamed the church, not just for the money, but for the destruction of his family. And then he saw Shinzo Abe, a man he believed had ties to that very organization. Abe had spoken at events linked to the Unification Church. He had praised its values, and to Yamagami, that made him complicit. He didn't hate Abe's politics. He didn't care about elections. He wanted revenge. Originally, Yamagami planned to kill the leader of the church, but access was impossible, so he turned to Abe, the most visible symbol of the group's influence. He built his own weapons, crude but deadly. Metal pipes, batteries, black tape. He tested them, refined them, and waited. On July 7th, he followed Abe to a speech in Okayama. Too crowded. He backed off. On July 8th, he tried again. As Abe spoke, Yamagami stood behind the crowd. He raised the weapon, fired once. Smoke burst, but missed. Then fired again. Abe collapsed. Security tackled Yamagami instantly. He didn't resist. He didn't flee. He told police, "I couldn't forgive the group." Abe supported them. "That's why I did it." Inside his apartment, police found more weapons, blueprints, explosives. He had planned this for a long time, and yet parts of Japan sympathized. Some saw him not as a terrorist, but as a broken man failed by institutions. A petition for leniency gathered thousands of signatures, but the law was clear. Yamagami was charged with murder, weapon production, and violating explosives laws. He faces life imprisonment. Shinzo Abe's death was not just a political assassination. It was the collision of personal trauma, religious influence, and public power. It exposed cracks in Japan's gun laws, its security protocols, and its relationship with shadowy organizations. And it reminded the world, even in the quietest places, even in the safest countries, a single bullet can rewrite history. Shinzo Abe's assassination was more than a national tragedy. It was a global shock. World leaders reacted with disbelief. President Biden called him a champion of democracy and a friend. Antony Blinken mourned him as a visionary who elevated U.S.-Japan relations. Italy, Taiwan, South Korea, and Poland all expressed sorrow, not just for the man, but for what his death symbolized. Even China, often at odds with Abe's policies, acknowledged his role in improving bilateral ties. But beyond the condolences, questions remained. How could this happen in Japan, a country with some of the strictest gun laws in the world? What does it say about the cracks beneath the surface of a seemingly peaceful society? And what legacy does Abe leave behind? He was a reformer, a nationalist, a strategist. He reshaped Japan's economy. He redefined its military posture. And he gave his country a louder voice on the global stage. But in the end, it was not a rival politician, not a foreign agent, not a radical extremist. It was a quiet man with a homemade weapon, a man broken by personal loss, a man who saw Abe not as a leader, but as a symbol. And with 2 shots, he silenced a voice that had echoed through decades of Japanese politics. If this story moved you, if you believe history must be remembered, not just the victories, but the wounds, then subscribe to the Red Pages of History. Because behind every headline, behind every bullet, there's a story worth telling, and we're here to tell it.